right, so theoretically, I'm trying it with the audio on green again just to see how it sounds today. Should be all right. I'm not sure. We'll find out. But in the meantime, tonight's topic is something I've been bending my brain to recently. I should probably get a little closer anyway. Something I've been bending my brain to play with for a little while. I know with my idea that I came up for setting last year, not just like the individual. I can't believe I'm saying 2020 was last year. It totally was, but it still feels like it's still here. Last year, we started out the year discussing the idea of the mega setting for game design and storytelling. And for me, that was just putting together the things I wanted to make a world out of, and then sort of figuring out how to make them happen. So I think we started with the idea of, so last year when we started with the idea of a setting that was going to be mega, like a central setting with the setup of being shunted to other locations, other pieces of space-time. So you went from the central setting to the zombie apocalypse setting versus the, I think it was the Medusa setting, the zombie apocalypse setting, and the superhero setting, all tacked on to the central premise of being a fantasy role-playing setting. So, when we started that last year, that was really like the premise of moving from one world to another, to another, to another. And doing it within the fantasy genre. And I'm still playing with that setting. I've got a lot more of it figured out than I had before. But I also had that nagging question in my head: could we do a setting like this for science fiction? And I think the previous year we worked on the project that was assembling a lot of my other slightly more contemporary, still sort of fantasy settings into one universe. I feel like just there's a part of my brain that says, for the sake of completeness, can we do a science fiction like future setting? So we've got like the knights in armor fantasy setting. We have the modern urban fantasy, I guess would be what we'd call it, setting, and then have a future setting. I like my brain says, for completeness sake, can we play with that? And I think I took a swing at it at one point with like a very rough kind of tree structure of the different settings that I might want to play with. And I just kind of set it aside because it was strung together reasonably well. But it was literally just saying, like, okay, if we took this franchise and connected it to this one through this path, it's not building a setting that has the things I liked out of a piece connecting to things I like about other things, and sort of spreading the influence around a little bit. But recently, one of the things that I just had one of those nights where, like, I can't sleep, something's pecking at my brain, so I sat up and just said, all right, let's play with it a little bit. And I came up with something that I think is reasonably good, but it tends to follow a strain of very specific type of sci-fi. There isn't some of the room for some of the other weirder fun play that I'm sometimes fond of. So it's not an all-inclusive, and we could theoretically we could just sit down and just say like, all right, so we could make a whole new one. So maybe we can do that sometime in the coming week or so. I'm not sure. For right now, I'm going to detail what I got for the first idea. I'm probably going to enjoy talking about this enough that I'm going to leave this live stream, sit on that bed, and end up brainstorming alternative settings. But for the start of this process, I'm going to start with the idea of somebody using, and I feel like one of the qualifiers for the mega fantasy setting that I came up with was that you went from one world, one land, one location to another and to another, sort of like compartmentalized hopping from world to world. This one feels a little bit more, and this is where it throws me off. This feels a little bit more like a hopping through time frames rather than individual worlds. So it's time instead of space that we're moving through, which is fine for fantasy in a certain sense, but it doesn't, like everything else we've made before as big mega settings have all been space movement, moving through space, where character 1 is introduced in world 1 and then travels to world 2, world 3, world 4, world 5, and then back to world 1, and it's all still there. This one, you can't go back in time. At least the way I built this one, there's no time travel. But the thing I started with is if you've ever seen the movie Limitless, the premise is essentially a drug is developed that opens up your mind to being super genius level. It has the caveat that if you take this drug and then you stop taking it, it can kill you. You have to continue to take it once you've started, and there's a limited supply. But I took that idea, I kind of liked the proposed setting with the idea that potentially this is more than just making you a genius. Like, it may make some people geniuses that could make new inventions and solve all sorts of problems. It may do a few other things to other people. And I'm kind of presaging where this is going to end up going, but if you look at settings like Frank Herbert's Dune, the spice melange, as it's referred to in the setting, is a drug refined from raw ingredients on the planet Arrakis into a consumable substance that opens the mind and grows one's consciousness, but also is addictive and makes you dependent on it for extended life. It can actually make you so you can live centuries. I guess if I remember correctly, you can live longer. It extends life. It improves health and opens your mind just to greater ability to think. But other variants built off of that are responsible for people with other gifts in Dune. I'm a little vague for certain on some of the backstory. If I remember correctly, like I barely remember the first book I read, but the second, I don't think I remember the second book either. The second time I was exposed to this story was the movie, and the movie has some adjustments to it. But if I remember correctly, the premise of a lot of the characters is there was a war with robots that was fought against thinking machines that tried to overthrow us. And since then, all thinking machines are banned. So, as a spacefaring organization of people who have semi-advanced technology, but have a prohibition against thinking machines, they found the loophole of specially breeding a population of people who are exposed to and trained through certain training measures and a drug that allows them to think like machines, run calculations and complex thought processes that are usually beyond the processes of most humans. And they're called the mentats. And the mentats have a drink that they take that stains their lips a certain color, and that drug is what I believe the litany is. By will alone I set my mind in motion, by the juice of Safu my thoughts acquire speed, the lips acquire stains, the stains become a warning, by will alone I set my mind in motion. So it's basically like this drug hyper ramps up the thinking process so that, you know, the thinking of calculations with the training that they go through to become mega math minds and strategy and tactics thinkers and planning and organizing thoughts and events and data is something that they are trained to do. And then they're given this drug that ramps up their ability to do that beyond human norms. And the Bene Gesserit is an organization of Reverend Mothers who have, through training and exposure to substances, predominantly a form of spice-derived, melange-derived elixir, been able to inherit the memories and training of previous generations. It's sort of like building a hive mind of Reverend Mothers. So by exposure to this substance, it opens their mind to the sort of internet of their mind, of data. It's the Wikipedia in their brain. It's the instant training. It's that moment in Matrix where Neo is on the chair and they plug him in and they just start uploading data on how to fight into his brain. And that's something that's done through the spice as well. And so part of me is of the mindset that the drug that we start at the beginning with, based off of the idea of limitless, should be something organic, something you can grow, something that becomes important in the ecology of the future civilization on a planet like that at the end. But the limitless drug being derived from a plant source or something like that, I have as a fungus, so probably like a mushroom, a psilocybin style experience that opens up the mind and abilities of the people who take it. And so you start to get things like the movie Scanners and Firestarter and movies like that, where people develop talents from their mind, like mental abilities. And then there's the movie Push, which is a setting in which secretly in the background there are people with different classes of mental abilities that are sort of just hidden among the world. And so like we're taking that from the drug of limitless to the sudden, especially if you do something like the children of the people who first took this drug are born with innate talents that are different. And you get this sort of inclusion of some of these different types of stories and settings built in. You could do Carrie, Stephen King's Carrie, things like that, where people unknowingly or knowingly have augmented their own minds with abilities past the human norm. And going from there, there's the movie Minority Report. But what we're going for is starting in a setting with a drug that's used by certain people that give them mental boosts and have some drawback consequences. But children born to people exposed to or in the throes of that drug are actually born with unusual abilities, and then going forward from there, being found and tracked down by government agencies, and certain ones with certain either precognitive or psychosocial awareness gifts are able to figure out where others are. And so you can have an organization that are using a few people with gifts to track down and capture others with these gifts. And that's very reminiscent of the effects in the movie Minority Report, where they use basically 3 precognitive people in a tank as a sort of a predictive computer to find out when crimes are going to be committed in the future and stop them from happening. There's a whole other backstory to some of the things that go on in Minority Report, but the overall arcing technology and the thing that makes that happen is people with precognitive abilities used as a means to capture other people who haven't done anything yet. And using that mindset and switching it over from political intrigue and police force stopping crimes to an organization hunting and trying to capture people with unusual gifts because they're a danger to the population around them is sort of fitting for where things would fit in my setting. And that's where a lot of these things are twisted out of their original context and plugged into a longer string that I'm building between them. From there, you have this organization that's capturing and imprisoning people with unusual abilities, and it can gradually become like, what do you do with them once you get them? Well, you can certainly try to keep them imprisoned. You can try to eliminate their abilities, sort of like cutting off a limb at that point. Or you can sort of draft them into your organization and sort of like make them soldiers for the company, for the government, for the organization that you're working for. And as you get further into that line of thinking, you can set them up as a special unit or special troops in a conflict that may arise when first contact is made with a species off-world. And yes, that sort of like drafted special forces unit probably holds on to people reasonably well, especially when your alternatives are to be turned into a disabled person or kept as a prisoner. If you don't opt to join the force, you tend to get a working force at that point. But you also risk somebody going rogue and, the hunt down of somebody like that. You get an organization, sort of secret organization or an off branch of the government that is hunting, capturing, and maintaining a population of drafted servants with gifts and hunting down anybody who tries to get away. Now, the hunting down of people trying to get away could be something like Logan's Run, where you have the Sandmen who would come and put to sleep anybody who went rogue. Now, I didn't really include that mindset necessarily, but that's, you can definitely take some of those flavor bits and put them in there. What I'm aiming more for is, if you've ever seen any of the Babylon 5 setting, you get something like the Psi Corps, which is a corps of psychically able individuals who serve the Earth government, sort of because they're drafted to do it. All people who have abilities must be put into this organization or must take a drug to prevent them from using their abilities. And so you have that sort of part of the process. But it's that aspect of being used for something, and that being used for something usually means at some point there's a major conflict. And if all of Earth's people with special abilities are drafted into that core, then the implication is it's not a war between sections of humanity in the solar system. They're being drafted to be functioning in a conflict on another world. Now, at the same time, I have the premise of the TV series Star Trek Enterprise had something like this, where we came in conflict with a group called the Xindi, I believe it was. And the stupid movie that came out that was supposed to be Starship Troopers, based off of Robert Heinlein's work, but wasn't anything like it. It was basically a script written as Bug Hunt or some such thing that was just rebranded to use the title Starship Troopers. But in the movie, the conflict between the humans and a bug population of an alien species is what happens. And within the Earth forces, people were being trained for and considered citizens only if they served in the military. That was one of the aspects. I'm not necessarily jumping on that gun, but you have that element of the Psi-Force, Psi-Corps kind of group only being granted citizen rights if they're a member of the military. You also have, like in the Star Trek Xindi conflict, the Star Trek Enterprise Xindi conflict, Starship Troopers and that story both included a moment where an alien civilization we had found had struck against Earth by dropping an asteroid on like California or something like that, and causing major disruption to the entirety of the world, but killing millions of people. And it's considered like the Pearl Harbor of those settings. And something like that happening with our first contact with another species would be the war that you could potentially be drafted into to be a Psi-Corps member or not, whether you're Psi-Corps or not. And there's a consequence to an asteroid strike like that to some degree, where if it's just a single asteroid hitting Earth, there's a consequence to it. But if you set it up so that it's not a one and done situation, but it's like perpetually making Earth a hard place to live in, you can set up the sort of dystopian living on the wasteland of Earth in city clusters bombarded by small fragments still in orbit around Earth kind of thing. And I feel like that's got potential for changing the view we have of things. If you make the Earth hard to live on, then only the people who can't get off of Earth will live on it. And so you have the ability to do a setup of a couple different settings where people are stuck on Earth, but other people are escaping Earth. And immediately the first thing that comes to mind is, well, if they're not on Earth, where are they going? Well, Mars colony, the lunar colony, maybe Venus. If you set up some arrangements to change or sort of terraform some of the moons around the gas giants, you then get the ability to set up a whole solar system full of planetary bodies that we could live on and build different types of populations and lifestyles. So this is very reminiscent of Cowboy Bebop, which is a Japanese animation in which they built a hypergate, one that allows you to travel from Earth to Jupiter in a short period of time. And that when they built their network, the gate they put on the moon blew up, tore a huge chunk of the moon out, and dropped it into Earth orbit and on Earth. And so it made Earth a hole, just a dump to live in, and nobody wants to live there. So they set up colonies on other bodies in the solar system. But it's very similar also to Firefly, where you have people used up Earth, or the Earth solar system wasn't usable anymore, so they moved to another solar system and established new worlds there by terraforming those worlds. And the central worlds became metropolitan, while the outer worlds became redneck backwater locations. And so you have this sort of Old West in space story style. Both of those things are possible with this idea of this Starship Troopers Xindi conflict, making Earth the hard place to stay, and as a result, people move to other planetary bodies in the solar system. So, further taking on the idea of that post-Earth setting, while not eliminating Earth as a place where things happen, you have people moving around the solar system. You have the ability to have sort of like the rogue outer worlds. So maybe colonies, like spaceship colonies, drifting along certain aspects of the solar system, or Titan or other moons around gas giants could be the equivalent of the worlds in Firefly, but also have in Firefly there's the Reavers. They're the people who went mad because of an experiment, spoilers I guess, an experiment done on an outside world on the edge of the solar system. Or in the TV series, it's sometimes implied that they're literally just, they spent too much time out in space alone, that they just went crazy and they became lunatics. In a movie called Chronicles of Riddick, there's a group of people called the Necromongers. And their premise has always been that sowing death and suffering in the universe is an important part of doing what the universe's purpose is supposed to be. And the Reavers are just crazy, and they cut people up and they eat their flesh and that kind of thing. So like the two are not the same thing, but you can find a middle ground between the two of them that you can use for your villainous fanatics. And the thing about the Chronicles of Riddick as a series of movies, the first one was Pitch Black. Pitch Black has him living on a planet of darkness wherein there are species of monsters that live in the dark that are sort of like bug-like and lizard-like. And so if this is a beachhead or an initial set of troops from the bugs from the Starship Trooper setting that launched the asteroid at Earth, then you can certainly set that up to work well enough in this setting. But notice they're bug-like, So Starship Troopers, Pitch Black, but also the H.R. Giger style alien could be counted in some of those elements. And so maybe there's room for aliens within this setting. But it's all going to take place on the edges of the solar system, out in the not quite terraformed, not quite inhabited regions, where it's that frontier, that edge that you keep bumping against the things that bump back in the night. But it's also possible to do things like Enemy Mine, which is one of my favorite movies of all time, with some of those elements. And there's room for something like the video game StarCraft, especially if you're going to play on the edges of Alien and Aliens. That hive species of creature with a queen and whatever creature that they parasitically attach to lends features to the larval form that emerges. And so you get different varieties of the xenomorphs and aliens based off of if they were hatched from a dog or a cow or a human. Those kinds of things make a difference. And based off of ideas like that, you have the potential for StarCraft, the video game, where you're encountering the Zerg as a alien species who absorb or assimilate into their population other creatures. And so you have that. And again, as we talk about assimilation, we can jump over into Star Trek setting. So all this is going on in the solar system around Earth, which has made it uninhabitable or undesirable to be an inhabitant of because of the attack by this bug-like species that is encroaching on the edges of our solar system and potentially absorbing some of our pioneers into the hive. And then we have the idea of those stuck on Earth are left with sickness, injuries, and a half-abandoned world. And as a consequence, like early days of that, dangerous outside world, you have the chance to do something like Ready Player One, or even going further into the surface world is uninhabitable. What did we do in the meantime? The Matrix. The Matrix was a world in which they nuked the world above so that the world was just unoccupiable by the robots, and they couldn't use it for power, so the robots built the Matrix and plugged humanity into it. Now, I'm not going to use the whole humans as batteries scenario, but having a human-made Matrix or a Oasis from Ready Player One is an option. And having that sort of dystopian outside world with struggles and hardships that make it more desirable to dwell within a artificial world, that seems like it's a reasonable way to start exploring those concepts. And eventually, maybe as the timeline progresses, it becomes easier to live within the upside world. And with that in mind, you can start looking at things like Ghost in the Shell. What is the Blade Runner, and other things like that, where you have people who are more machine than human, cyborgs and those types of things. And somewhere in the mix of this, some completely artificial people. But they're gonna be owned things. They're machines still. They're not the same as us. We're real and they're not. And then, the story of Blade Runner comes into play about hunting them down and whether or not they count as people. Um, you have the characters like Bishop and Ash from the Aliens series. They're artificial. And so we have the idea of potentially a leader among them becoming a rebel, and there are consequences to that. You have in one of the famous cyberpunk settings of Neuromancer, I believe it was Neuromancer, in which an AI finds a way to transmit itself off the world and to seek out their fortunes somewhere else. There's room for that, but there's also the idea of the puppet master who takes over the cybernetic bodies of humans, sort of enclosing the human inside the shell while they take over the body. And taking over some completely artificially constructed bodies. But once you have somebody like the puppet master taking over, blending in as appearing to be a cyborg, but being a constructed being and manipulating people and events around them, you have the possibility of doing something like the Cylons from the recent Battlestar Galactica, where there were people who didn't know they weren't people. I guess that's another spoiler. And within that frame of reference, you can do something like Terminator, where the whole point behind a Terminator was they're a machine made to look like and fool people into thinking they're a person, but they're not. They're just hunters. They're not quite the puppet master, but they could definitely serve on that purpose. So the Battlestar Galactica Cylons and the Terminators being similar leads us to a Butlerian jihad, which is what the Dune universe says was the war against the thinking machines. Those thinking machines had tried to conquer us and destroy us, and the war that was led against them ultimately set us free from their influence, but built a universe in which people needed an equivalent to the mentats, the computer thinking humans, the people who could pass on their knowledge through a ritual with a certain drug. And so we get back towards that Psi-Core mental augmentation through a drug approach. And within that framework, we have the foundations of some of the things that happened in Dune, but with my own spin on it. And somewhere in the middle of all of that, we're going to have to keep the thread of not just the we're going to have the discussion of, or the timeline moments of the people with the powers that are above the human norm, the war with the aliens, and that sort of conflict going on, with the cyberpunk setting going down on Earth. Through that thread, there should be some continuation of each of them. So, like, the conflict that causes the psychic power situation to come up happens before the war with the aliens, but it has overlapping consequences when people start leaving the planet Earth. And once they're off the planet Earth and colonizing other local planets in the solar system, they're still having, like, that need to leave Earth is a consequence that leads to that war with the bug population. But the psychic people don't go away. Their events still get played out. And part of their event is, now, as part of the military that they're part of, the people going rogue, do we set up an organization of people to support them as an underground network? And if we do that, do they become sort of like a Jedi Order? How do we set that up? Do we set that up in a very specific way as like they become the Jedi of the setting? The sort of like a free franchise of psi-powered individuals that are not controlled by the central governments, that can be seen as sort of like the Beowulf kind of character, the roving heroes who come to help the people who need their help. And gradually, the loss of power in the centralized government, or the split that results from some of those things, causing a sort of opportunity for, I don't know, like an opportunity for because there's another series that I kind of am a fan of that uses people with special abilities. It's called the Hive and Tower series by Anne McCaffrey, and I'm a big fan of it. The way they organize that setup is people with abilities are seen as very valuable, and so they are often brought into academies to be trained and become guild members of an organization, which I don't know if she did it jokingly or if that was just an expedient way to do it, but she set it up as like an AT&T. But in this case, it's I forget what the A stands for, but it's T&T stands for telepaths and telekinetics. And it's basically they are their own organization. The government has no control over and cannot interfere with the workings of that organization. And they set up a way of moving ships through the solar systems and the interstellar space using powerful telekinetics, and they set a means of communicating between worlds instantaneously through telepaths. So a telepath can be sitting on a special seat, which offers augmentation to their abilities by providing additional power. So it's sort of like it's an electric chair, but it's not an electric chair. It's a chair that gives you extra energy that you can tap into with your abilities and telepathically communicate with somebody at another point in space instantly. And when you've made that contact, you can make the arrangements to use that extra energy from the chair to boost your telekinesis, to take an object and move it to the reach of the next person who can grab a hold of it and pull it to them, and that's how you move through the worlds. That is very similar to a way of making movement between worlds in a solar system faster, like the gates in Cowboy Bebop. But it is also very similar to the Spacing Guild in Frank Herbert's Dune. The Spacing Guild is another organization whose powers come from a gaseous form of the spice that they dwell within in zero gravity. They breathe it, they swim in it, they absorb it through their skin. They become like fish people, like Abraham Sapien from Hellboy. But they absorb enough of the spice that it's mutated them, and their mutation allows them the ability to calculate movements through space-time to avoid the dangers of colliding with planets or other objects as you pass through. It gives them sort of precognition in order to be able to say, this is a safe path. Because remember, they can't have an R2-D2 unit because thinking machines are outlawed. So in Star Wars, they use an R2-D2 to make the hyperspace calculations for them. But they can't do that in Dune, so they have to resort to somebody who can think the path they need to take. And that requires somebody who can see the consequences of the actions that are being made and predict the right course to take. And that was spice augmented individuals. Now, would that spacing guild be an offshoot of the Psi-Corps, which maybe would be an offshoot of the Psi-Corps leads to the Hive and Tower, AT&T leads to the Spacing Guild? The Psi-Corps, I feel like, really is a government agency, whereas the AT&T and that basically the towers and the Spacing Guild are guilds. They're legitimately organizations of craftsmen, essentially. They're unions. They're organizations of people with gifts and abilities supported by the guild. And the guild is an autonomous organization within itself. I think you'd have to have a story at some point of the War of Independence for Psi-Corps. And I think that's doable if we set it up that way. It's also possible to say that the AT&T is what becomes of the people who rebel against Psi-Corps. And that Psi-Corps may eventually end up evolving into the Jedi equivalent. I'd have to think about that a little bit more. But there's room for a lot of play within that setting. Now, as I said before, when we started early on, I am a little hesitant to commit this as the one future setting that I'm doing for my trilogy of settings, I guess, unintentionally doing a trilogy of settings. Because those are different worlds. This is different times within a timeline. I mean, technically, you could have different worlds where you would have somebody living the cyberpunk world of Earth at one time, somebody else fighting the bugs at the periphery of the solar system. And at the same time, you could have the competition for, like I said, the Jedi versus the Hive and Tower population going on different worlds, different colonies, different. I mean, I believe one of the ways that we've talked about settling in space was called an O'Neill cylinder, which is basically a tube where on the inside of the tube you put a cap on either end that lets sunlight in, and there's a mirror on one end and an open window essentially on the other end, and the sunlight shines into it, giving you enough light to grow crops on the interior, and you spin it so that there's one Earth gravity on the surface of the inside of the cylinder, and that's your colony. Like, you could do a bunch of those. I mean, so there's ways of settling. I mean, you can settle Titan. I think there are probably 5 or 6 moons of Jupiter, and Saturn has like 4. And I don't know if Neptune or Uranus have enough large moons that you could turn them into colonies. But, I mean, it's science fiction. We can fudge some of those details a little. and you could set up floating cities in Venus's dense atmosphere, O'Neill cylinders around the solar system. If you could move a moon from one location to another, you could probably bump some things into some new orbits and get a functional planet from them. You could probably collect a bunch of asteroids together and build a planet. There are ways to put 7 or 8 planets within the solar system easily, with some additional space stations and O'Neill cylinders. You could have a fair number of places to play around with. I feel like my concern still sets with, like, there isn't a sweet spot in this setting idea where all the things are happening at the same time. You don't get that limitless early days of psychic powers and the mysterious organization using precogs or something like them to track down and capture people with special abilities. You don't get to have that story at the same time you're dealing with the Ghost in the Shell or the Matrix setting. Like, one has to be before the other. And that's not really the same as my other settings where we had the ability to move from a world of Medusas to a world of zombie apocalypse to a world of superheroes, and then back to any of them again. If you want to travel back to another world, you can do it. We don't have that kind of pass through a doorway, go to a new place setting. And I kind of want to see if I can make something that would work from that perspective. I will still play with this one, I think. But I think, and we're getting close to an hour here, but I think next time, which is Tuesday, I'll see if we can brainstorm up something else. I'll probably pick a couple foundations before then to play with. But I feel like I want to do a multiple worlds setting. And honestly, like off the top of my head, the Stargate universe is a good starting point for that. And I mean, we did a brainstorm about how to do a Stargate like story that wasn't sci-fi and wasn't traveling to other worlds, but instead other realities. We did that earlier in 2020. Or actually, I think we did that one halfway through 2020 when we redid some of those things. Or was that Shrink Park? No, that was Jurassic Park. So what was the first Stargate story we did? That might have been time travel. I don't remember. I'd have to go back and look. But Stargate gives a good foundation for hopping to other settings. Because that's really what we're trying to do. It doesn't necessarily have to be another world. It just has to be another setting. There's got to be a way to do that. I'll have to think about it. So that's, I guess, going to be it for tonight. I didn't think I was going to ramble for almost an hour about it. And I'm not sure I was clear. I'm sure it sounded a little jumbled, but made sense while I was saying it. I don't know if it made sense to you. I hope it made sense. Some kind of sense. But I I do think it would be fun to build a future sci-fi setting. Because ultimately what I'd like to do is the fantasy setting that I've built, I can do some tabletop role-playing game design for, and I can write some books and short stories in, and offer them up as playgrounds for other people to create stuff for, which would be a lot of fun. The other setting that was a compilation of my story ideas built into a universe together with worlds to travel between. That one was just a means of trying to collect all my stories together into one universe, but I could probably do something similar there. It's less built around the idea of being able to share a universe for the stories. So, like, there's an aspect of that setting where there's wizards and magic, and then there's an aspect of that world that's a world without magic. And actually, most of that setting is magic setting. Yeah, so that's more of a. It's still contemporary fantasy. I don't know. I would call it urban fantasy. It's very Harry Potter in the sense of like there's a world of magic in our world, but obscured from our eyes. That one's the one where the Goblin's Daughter story was supposed to be based in. Um, could I build a gameplay universe with that for tabletop, computer games, and writing novels? And I can definitely write novels. I can definitely write novels and short stories in it. Could I set it up as a computer game or a tabletop role-playing game or even a board game? It's possible. It would take a little extra work because the settings are so very different. But on the other score, like that one can be the central one or not. At another point, we may just design a new central world or central world built. But having the fantasy on one end, having the sci-fi on the other end, that's at least what we need to do. I can worry about how well the middle fits. I think also the other thing to say is potentially it might be mistaken that we could go from Conan the Barbarian fighting monsters and this fantasy setting kind of idea to jump 1,000 years into the future and you have the starting point of the sci-fi, and that is never going to happen. My fantasy setting is too different from my sci-fi to be viable as the same universe at different times. But do we want to do? Like, do we want to take my fantasy setting, get a contemporary time period and a future time period for it? And more to that mindset, if we build this story idea that we just talked about tonight into a setting, do we want to build backwards into history to give it a fantasy setting? We just made a whole bunch of new projects to play with, I guess. I'm going to definitely call it there before I get myself into any more trouble. But for now, I will say thank you for joining me tonight. I hope you are well. Thank you for listening to my wild and crazy rambles, and I will catch you on Tuesday night. For now, take care and have a good night. Yeah.